to be ignited. And we're aiming in these weeks of Lent to be sure that our hearts can be lit with that story of light and peace and reconciliation. So thanks to everyone for joining us. It's a gift and a joy to be together.
Indeed it is. So we're here to talk about the seventh story, and those of you who've been with us every week, and if this is your first time visiting, you're all welcome. Here's a recap of what the 6 stories are. These are stories that we think human beings have developed to try to make sense of our lives, particularly to bring about peace and security. See if you recognize these from your own life. The first is the domination story, the idea that I will get peace and security by ruling over you. The second is a reaction to the domination story, and it's the story of retribution, revenge, or revolution, where I will get peace and security by overthrowing you and then ruling over you. The third story we call the purification story. It's the one where we say it's your fault or it's that group's fault because of what they believe, what they teach, what they do, sometimes even as absurd as what they wear or what they believe. And the way we'll get peace and security is by purifying ourselves of those people, either by building hard boundaries around ourselves or just exterminating those people, whoever they happens to be. And I always say, even if it's just character assassination, it's still assassination. The fourth story is the isolation story. And this is the story where people feel like, I've had enough. I'm going to withdraw, depart, maybe go to the desert or an island somewhere and try and build a new community where we'll get it right this time. And we know that the history of utopian communities is that they're not very utopian. And pretty soon people start ruling over each other and having revenge-based revolutions and purification narratives. That's the isolation story. And the fifth story we call the victimization story. That's the story we're going to focus on tonight. And it's the story that says, my suffering is the most important thing about me. It's my very identity. And if you try to take that away from me, I will kill you. Entire nations have been built on this story. The sixth is the story of accumulation, which is I'm just going to get more stuff for myself, whether it's a sofa or a country. And that's what's going to bring me peace and security. All these stories believed by humans and dogs who are barking in the background. I don't know if our dog Tupelo believes this story or not. We try to run our house on the 7-story model. These stories show up in many cultures. What they have in common is that they don't work. Another thing they have in common is they're based on separation of humans from each other, from God, from the ecosystem. And another thing we maybe haven't talked about enough in these calls yet is they are all based on trying to meet a legitimate need. The need for security, belonging, safety, that's a legitimate need. There are more or less legitimate ways of trying to get that need met. And we believe that the seventh story, the story of liberation and reconciliation, is a better way of getting those needs met. It also happens to be truer than the other stories. So BMAC, I want to ask you, would you say a little bit more about the victimization story, what it might have looked like in Jesus's time, why it's so important? And then we'll ask Bamo to speak to his thoughts on it.
Yes. Well, the victimization story to me is so interesting in the 4 Gospels because it makes sense of a whole lot of what Jesus does. It to me just adds a fascinating kind of backlight to Jesus, how he spends most of his time. Let's start with economic victimization. The Roman Empire was dominating over Jesus and his whole nation, the Jewish people. And one of the things that dominating nations do is they occupy with military force, and then they call that a benefaction. They call that, we're doing you a favor by occupying you. Now, I know it's really hard to imagine any nation claiming anything like that, but it happens. And then what they do is they charge taxes to the people for the benefit of being occupied and dominated. And so the Jewish people bear the brunt of taxes. Now, I know it's hard to imagine a world where rich people find ways of getting out of paying their percentage of the taxes, and
Ridiculous.
and poor people suffering disproportionately. But in Jesus' day, the majority of people were small farmers. Maybe they produced enough to pay to feed their family and a little more to bring to market. And they lived in Galilee. If you've ever been to Israel, Palestine, Galilee is still a beautiful green farmland. You just realize, that this is the setting where Jesus grows up. And because of Roman taxation, these farmers can't pay for their taxes. And so their rich countrymen from the south come up and say, oh, we'll pay your taxes. You just sign over your deed to us. And then we'll every year expect a tribute. So in a certain sense, the poor farmers of Galilee are under a double victimization, first by the Romans and then by their own countrymen who take advantage of that situation and doubly oppress them. Isn't it interesting that Jesus spends most of his time in Galilee, and he's going from village to village, and think about what he's doing. These are poor people. Poor people can't afford an education. He gives them free education. Poor people can't afford health care. He provides free health care. And when he heals people. And when he does, he doesn't say to them, I am the only one who can make you healthy. Remember my name. But instead he says, your faith has saved you. Again and again, your faith has saved you. As if to say, you're victimized. You've been put at the bottom of the pyramid, and I'm here to tell you that you have power if you just believe it. Stop believing that you're powerless and worthless. Stop valuing yourself the way these double layers of oppression are valuing you. Rediscover your own inherent worth. Think about how God, and imagine Jesus saying this out in the country. Think about how God cares of the sparrows in the air and the flowers in the field. They're valuable and you're valuable. You see the same dynamic at work in an interchange. For example, when Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman, she's victimized in the sense, first of all, that her society is seen as an inferior society by their neighbors. Jesus thinks she's worth talking to. As a woman, she experiences victimization. And in her particular story, it appears there's been a good amount of sexual victimization that she's been subject to. And I know it's hard to imagine a world where women are sexually victimized and then blamed for it. But there is part of the shame that this woman lives with. Jesus treats her like an intelligent conversation partner and invites her to, in a sense, be part of spreading good news about that he's bringing. Just so many more examples we could give. But let me just jump forward to one other. Later in the New Testament, after Jesus' death, resurrection, we come to the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 8, one of the early disciples named Philip has an encounter with an Ethiopian eunuch. And we don't have time to go into the whole story. It's in Acts chapter 8. But here's a person who is racially other, nationally and religiously other, and he's sexually other. He's not, he doesn't fit into the normal heterosexual male category that people considered normative then, and many still do today. And what is so interesting is in the moment where Philip and this man connect, and this man decides he wants to become part of what we're calling the seventh story, he asks if he can be baptized. He says, is there anything that would prohibit me from being baptized? As if to say, does my skin color, does the tone of my voice because I was castrated, does anything forbid me. And Philip doesn't say, let's go back to Jerusalem and have a 6-year study process. He walks down into the water with him and he's baptized. Another way of showing that the victimized are welcomed in. So I just think seeing the victimization story and seeing how Jesus and those who follow Jesus respond to it it's just it's beautiful. And in some ways it shines light both on Jesus and on his seventh story.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, Bamo, Brian Ammons, I know you quite well, and the people listening in on the call may not. So let's start with this question. Who are you? What's your vocational work?
So I'm Brian Ammons. I'm the chaplain at Warren Wilson College here in Asheville. I'm also joining this call from one room away. I'm and one of the other roles I play in my life is that I'm Gareth's husband. So I'm born and raised in North Carolina and have stayed in the South with intention. And I have a very deep love affair and complicated relationship with home. I have deep roots in Southern Appalachia and the Asheville area, and that's a part of my identity that I wear with a lot of pride and respect. I am ordained. I'm an ordained Baptist minister in the Alliance of Baptist tradition, which is a progressive vein of Baptist life, and I think I've had a long and beautiful and complicated relationship with church, as many of us have, and I imagine many of the folks on this call have. I know both of y'all have, and I'm grateful for that journey and for the wrestling.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a question about victimization story, if I may. One of the first things that comes up for me whenever I recount or summarize the 6 stories as we understand them is when I say entire nations have been built on the victimization story, or that the victimization story is the one that says my suffering is the most important thing about me, and if you try to take that away from me, I'll hurt you. I'm thinking of my own land, the north of Ireland. I'm thinking about people I've known who've suffered in just unbelievably extensive and terrible ways, some of whom have been assisted with not taking revenge, and some of whom have said that they bear no ill will to the people who caused the suffering in their life, and a smaller number of whom have used the words, I forgive. And I care very much about this because I think we often use the word forgive and we aren't really sure what it means. And I think in like a popular sense, it can mean almost something like embracing the person who caused you terrible pain 24 hours after the incident happened, you know? And I'm always aware when I try to summarize the 6th story, I haven't found an adequate way to speak to the fact that there are sufferings in the world that are real and are terrible. And that falling into the victimization story might be the most natural thing in the world. The desire for revenge might be the most natural thing in the world. So the question I have is to ask you to speak to this question of forgiveness and mercy and withholding revenge. And I know you want to acknowledge something about us being, you know, I'll acknowledge we're 3 white men here talking about the victimization narrative, and we're aware that we are limited as a result of that, and we all have stories that are real. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this question of mercy, forgiveness, revenge?
That's interesting, Gareth. So I think there's a difference between the experience of being a victim and living by a victimization narrative. Because one of the things that feels important to me to name is I think it would be, I would be cautious to deny the reality of experiences of victimhood, of being victimized. Part of my story is that I'm a survivor of sexual violence within a church context. And then I've also grew up gay in the South, or queer identified in the South. And I think, there's parts of my life that I just was standing there and things happened to me. So there's questions about, for me, that can be dangerous when we are challenging victimization narratives, to not deny the realities of real suffering. I think there's also a place of then trying to figure out, what do you do with that story? And that to me is the path towards healing. So I don't think you can really disrupt a victimization narrative without doing significant work around grief and healing. And that work takes time. So, we talk in survivor circles of the move from victim to survivor, and then even sort of what comes after surviving. Some people use the language of thrive. There's other, some say victim, survivor, victor. I don't really, that language does not resonate with me particularly. But I think there is a space of sort of what's the greater integration, even from a survivor story. And that to me is really moving towards what I understand of y'all talking of the seventh story. So for me, I think there's a significant piece in thinking through what's it mean to forgive. And there's a couple different ideas that come up for me. One is the notion of forgiveness being letting go of having had a different past. So part of my own journey and my own survivor work, and which ultimately led to 20 years, 25 years after the sort of 3 years of abuse for me, being involved, being one of several boys that came forward in a court case. I was the oldest of a group of us that came forward. And so had this experience of sitting in the room with my abuser again, and telling those stories in a public space, in a public way. And part of that experience for me was letting go of the years of sort of trying to have made my story something other than what my story was. It required a direct acknowledgement of it. So really the giving over of that, the letting go of the story having been different. I think the other piece for me is, can we find a way that we can look towards the future together? And, my abuser and I will never speak again. I mean, by court order, that will be, I won't ever have that space for him. But there is,
so just to clarify that, but by court order, you are prevented from being in.
He's prevented from being in contact with me, and right. It seems through. Yeah, so we won't engage each other directly, and I will. To me, it is a sort of. I'm very suspicious of our court system, so let me name that. And our legal system is a very complicated thing for me to agree to participate in it. I will say, however, that at the best interpretation of that is that with the help of a larger community, can we get to circumstances that we can all be sort of saying like, okay, can we move forward from here? And I think at its best, that's what larger community can do and being a part of those healing spaces. So I don't know if that's pointing towards your question. I think that's certainly true when I hear you talk about experiences of Northern Ireland as well.
So why do you? Well, do you want to ask me a question about that to give you a bit of a break? Because you and I have another question for you.
I'm good. I trust the flow. You can
Okay.
jump in with whatever you need.
Well, I mean, the question I would ask you is, why do you think you did not go fully down a road towards revenge, bitterness, resentment, and hatred? What was the intervention and the support you got that helped you? And we can say part of these things are just mysterious, and part of these things may be to do with personality and previous formative experiences. And we're not asking you to speak about to blow your own trumpet, as it were. I think it's a really important. Our world really needs examples of people who have chosen not to take revenge, but still take the violation seriously, still believe in some form of accountability, still believe in restorative justice, still believe that the people responsible for causing suffering have a case to answer, but that it should be answered in a restorative way.
Sure. And I'll say I don't know that we got to restorative justice in this case. I know that we got to a space that felt like containment. Yeah. And that feels
containment.
And I feel like in our criminal justice system at the current moment, that's the best that I felt like I could hope for in that.
So this individual has been restrained from doing these things again, which is a good thing and a necessary part of restorative justice. But the institutional justice system at this point does not bring about restoration.
Not here.
Right. Looking back, what do you think it was that was the intervention with you that guided you away from what would have been a totally natural and a very typical path to take, which would have been the path of revenge, the path of bitterness?
Well, here's what I'll say is there's two things that come up for me, and I think this is common for people that experience have the sorts of experiences that I'm talking about there. One is that mostly got turned on me. So to say that I didn't go down that path would not be true or fair. I went to some really, really dark places and spent a good part of my 20s, surviving by blacking out, and alcohol was a big part of my story. And there was all kinds of things that I did to not feel what I was feeling. And I lived in a cultural context in which to speak out about it. Particularly, I was young, I was gay, I was in the South, I was a public school teacher and then a youth minister. So trying to figure out anything that I said, particularly in the 90s, I mean, I was implicated in, despite the lack of rational logic of that. We just weren't in a cultural moment that there was. So the limited amount of speaking out about it that I did was within that context. So what I can say is that by the time that I got to a place where I was re-engaging him, where there had been a couple of decades that had passed, where I was re-engaging him directly, and it's important for me to name that there were a couple of attempts to try and figure out how to hold him accountable earlier, but it was a complicated space. It was before Boston. The landscape was very different as to how churches respond. Yeah. By the time I got to that place, I think I had really already gone through that process of letting go of the story being different, of trying to figure out. I had walked to the edge more than once of having the thing that I'm grateful for, the moments of choosing life, of walking up to the edge and saying, okay, no, I'm choosing to live. we've had this conversation before, Gareth, that I have heard you frame my story as a story that's with courage. It never felt like courage to me. It felt like just trying to live, just choosing to be alive, and recognizing that required increasing amounts of being honest, and then making choices that by the time this story became a public story, to not just be named as an anonymous person in it, but to claim my voice and my face and put that out there. And to do that in church circles particularly. So part of my return to Christianity was all about this. I grew up in a Christianity that really insisted at its core that we are all beloved children of God, and nobody can take that from us. And so for me, that first meant, hey, I'm a beloved child of God. And that can't be ripped from me, despite what individuals within the church have done, and later what the institutions of the church did, and being clear that I didn't have a home to be fully a part of it. I later found a church that embraced me fully, but and it also meant, though, that I held that ethic towards everyone. I don't like everyone in the world. I don't get to choose not to love everyone. That to me feels like that is so in the DNA of that church of of where I went down and knelt at the altar beside my grandmother every month. That's so in me. It just meant sort of, how do I live into that? So I was really insistent as I was going into that court process that the only way I can survive this is not to buy into the narrative of that this is a monster, which is very much the narrative that was thrust onto me, and very much the narrative of the legal system. So I had to figure out, what's it mean for me to go into that space, insisting that I view the person who engaged in all this abuse with me as a person, as a beloved child of God. And if I didn't do that, then I wouldn't survive it. Because what it was doing to me, to live with him as a monster, to live in that story, kept me stuck in the place of being an 11 to 14-year-old boy that didn't have much power or agency. So it became a place of reclaiming my dignity, to step into that. And, it's the Jesus story. I mean, I have taken vows to be in leadership in a tradition that asserts some pretty ridiculous stuff. And part of that is Jesus's own victimization, and that's not the end of the story. It's a story of love, and they tried to destroy that story, and it wouldn't die. And it's interesting for me and framing that through this Lenten journey, and that some of my Lenten journey, Gareth, as you know, has been connected with this notion that seems like it shouldn't be as surprising to me, a new idea to me, as it is of Jesus' own sexual victimization, which is, there's an increasing body of work. You can speak to David's work on this maybe a little bit, Gareth. At least I want to acknowledge him appropriately in it, and other people that are doing work around even the parts that we know that are obvious of the sort of the stripping, the sexual shaming that happens in that piece in the crucifixion narrative, and what we know of Roman crucifixion likely included the rape of Jesus. And that's hard for me to even say out loud. And I feel at times, as I have rested into that notion, how was I never given that story? That's a story that I've so needed, that this is part of that crucifixion. This is part of that body broken. That's not the end of that story, but is part of that story. So My Lent
Jesus,
this year has been tied up in there.
the Jesus' solidarity with you is greater than you had been told.
Oh, yeah.
And that to speak to this for a moment,
and let me say this before you, just because I don't want to lose the thread on it. The post-resurrection Jesus didn't seek revenge, right? So Jesus goes into the tomb. There's that Holy Saturday of silence, but post-resurrection Jesus is not about either staying in a victim narrative of look what was done to me, or staying in or shifting to a revenge narrative, or one of those other 6 stories. It's a thing of doubling down on a narrative of love, and so I don't think I get away from that. I tried to run away from it. It kept finding me.
So if you want folks who are listening in at the moment, if you want to know more about the stuff that Brian's just alluded to, David Toombs, Tumbs, at the University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a former colleague of mine, is doing a lot of work around this, along with Jamie Reeves. Jamie's name is spelled Jayme, Jamie Reeves, and if you
who's
Google,
been talking about the Jesus 2 movement.
If you Google Me Too Jesus and look for Jamie Reeves and David Toombs' name, you'll find some stuff that can be heavy reading, but the pastoral counselors, the therapists, the chaplains, the clergy people, the lay people, the people of open hearts and open minds who are coming to terms with this kind of stuff are finding that this is nothing but good and healing and helpful stuff, especially for people who've grown up with an image of Jesus that we've been told he suffered in all the ways we have suffered. Well, there appears to be historical evidence that that's truer than we might want to face, and it's too big a topic for us to go into more detail on tonight. But I just want to say to you, if you're listening now or on the recording and this is stirring things in you that might be painful or feel vulnerable, in the first instance, you can reach out to us and we can help you find someone who can help walk you through this. You can contact us. That's we're not, well, one of us actually does do pastoral counseling type stuff, but that's in the institution where he works. I know we're committed to helping people find the love and support you need. And in my own way, in terms of the things I've survived, which are not the same things as the things Brian's been talking about, to believe that Jesus really has been there was a cliche throughout my childhood, my adolescence, and my early 20s. But when I return to it anew now, it is the most powerful idea. He walks with me and he talks with me, and he's been there and been further than I can imagine. I have one really simple factual data question for you, Bamo, and then BMAC, if you have something you want to ask of Brian, great, and then we'll move toward doing a little brief version of the porch circle questions to wrap up. Just because I've heard you say this often, what do you think is the most effective way churches could prevent sexual violence?
Thank you for offering the platform. I'm a big proponent of comprehensive sexual education, and the reason, there's several reasons why I think that I'm a big proponent of that. In this particular context, church cultures that talk openly about sex and sexuality break silences that violence depends on. So part of my own story, particularly as a young queer man in the South, is that my abuser was the only person that was willing to talk to me about sex and sexuality. And so he could exploit that. And so a church culture that opens up that space and that does that with children from birth, it does that with all of us from birth through adulthood, makes it really hard to hide in the shadows. And those shadows are dangerous spaces. And I think we set our kids up when we don't do that. So thanks for letting me say that. You know, that's an important, important piece for me.
Yeah.
And it's part of what I get to do in my day-to-day life. And I'm grateful for that.
And isn't there like some published resources to help with kind of sex positive sex
Sure.
education in churches? What's the name of the?
Our Whole Lives.
Our Whole
that
Lives.
was written in, and has been revised. And there's actually now an older adults version of the curriculum, but that goes from birth through older adults, that was done by the Unitarian Universalists and United Church of Christ together. So there's a Christian component to it and a UU that's kind of a broader ethical component. It's great stuff. It's great materials. I'm a big fan of it. There are other things out there, but if you're interested in that, then it's a good place to start.
Thank you.
Let me say first, Bamo, I've known you for a long time. I didn't know this part of your story till today.
Oh, really?
So thank you for sharing that. It strikes me also that in terms of these 6 stories that in some ways create this need for a 7th story, when you're victimized, one of your options is revenge, to try to inflict the pain that's been inflicted upon you back on the person who inflicted it. And that's, of course, the revolution or retaliation or retribution story. But the other one is to take that pain and inflict it on ourselves. And it sounds like sometimes that leads us to suicide, because sometimes it leads to self-hatred, because we think other people count me worthless, other people count me inferior. And in some way we internalize it, and we almost then turn it on ourselves, you know. Or it makes us say, this pain of being victimized by others is so great that I just have to anesthetize. And so drugs or alcohol or whatever, or maybe even, you know, other kinds of addictions, sex addictions, food addictions. There are ways of trying to comfort ourselves, because to try to heal ourselves of our victimization. One we haven't mentioned, some of us are victimized by disease. There isn't even anybody to blame. It's just, or an accident or something that puts us in the position where we feel we've been put into a box and reduced and limited. And this realization that a story could come to us and say, they don't get the last word. Don't dignify them with the last word. Don't dignify this disease with the last word. In some ways, what really becomes necessary then is having some other human beings around us who embody an alternative story. You do have value. You do have worth. I do not condemn you. And that's where this beautiful contagion happens, that when we start living by the 7th story, we can't help but treat people as if they had this dignity that victimization robs them of. So, and one last thing, I just think nothing could have been said more powerful than what you said, Brian, that will help all of us when we come to Good Friday and we try to take seriously the victimization of Jesus, and this sense that the victimization did not eternally destroy him. It wasn't the last word. I mean, he truly was victimized, but yet there was a way through it. And on the other side of it, there was a new beginning. And my goodness sakes, that's good news.
Thank you for that, Brian. It feels really important to me to name that. I mean, we're looking back and in 20 minutes talking about a process that was 25 years. So folks, if there's people that are in this process for whatever it is, own where you are. And
that's right.
I don't, and there's not one way through it. I mean, my story is not everyone's story in this. There are folks that I know that have needed really to step back from this at all. There's folks, part of my journey has been to lean into it and to companion other people through it. And ultimately, honestly, to also companion people that have been perpetrators. I mean, I've had several people in my life that are close people to me, that are important people to me, that have been relationships with folks who are also perpetrators of sexual violence. And that feels like part of my work. I can't do that with the person that was in that role with me, but I can be a part of that. And that's part of, for me, of engaging with my own humanity and continuing to claim my own humanity and resisting a story that monsterizes other people. I get that's not everybody's story, not the path for everyone. It has been for me. And part of the way that I don't feel like I ever chose Seventh Story. It feels like it keeps showing up. The universe is not subtle with me. My experience of God messes with my theology all the time and feels much more direct and interventionist than my formal theology allows. That I just keep getting invited to spaces of going like, okay, here we are. So go back into that work and draw from the well of the work that you've done in the healing staff. And I'm so grateful for the many, many people that stood by me through that. Some of those relationships I don't think didn't quite survive the strain of what it meant to companion me through that. And I'm deeply grateful for all of those folk. So there's a role of community in this. I don't know if I have a strong identification with the Lazarus story of Jesus standing outside the tomb and calling to Lazarus to come out. But Jesus doesn't go in and pick Lazarus up. Lazarus, whose hands and feet are bound and whose face is covered with a cloth, has to find his way out of the tomb. And then Jesus turns to the crowd that's gathered there and witness and says, unbind him, set him free. It's not Jesus that does the unbinding. It's the community that does the unbinding. And having been in that Lazarus place and had a community that bore witness to my choosing life, I feel really grateful that my sense of call as a community is to be part of that community of unbinding. And that to me is part of the counter to the victimization story. So
I want to say that a couple of our participants following along, Janie is saying, thank you so much for sharing your story. And so appreciate you speaking up and speaking out. And Paul says, this has been the most powerful time of sharing of this series. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, thank you, Paul, for listening.
Thanks to both of y'all.
Let's move toward closing with a really quick fire round of porch questions because we know them all well. And we ask these because they're ways some of us have found to deepen our lives and our sense of community and find the help that we need. And hopefully those of you listening are asking these questions of yourselves. I know some of you are listening in a group together somewhere. And so the first question is, what's bringing you life? One thing that's bringing you life. I'll respond first. I'm going to see, they may actually be my favorite band. I'm going to see them play tomorrow. They're an Irish traditional music outfit called the Gloaming, and I am so delighted. I have second row seats, and they're going on hiatus for an undetermined period of time, and that just makes me more grateful and feel more blessed. There's something in that for me generally. What's bringing you life, BMAC?
Last week I get to spend a half day trout fishing in the mountains of Virginia with one of my sons. Just spectacular.
Bamo.
I am in a week that is full of getting to sit with some people and some really big stuff, but also has some real moments of play. So I am this weekend hosting a drag show, and my improv troupe is performing, and I get to be in this kind of ridiculous mix of what's it mean to serve the community that I get to serve. So there's a lot of tears and laughter and dancing happening all mixed up in there together. And shaving my beard.
The beard is coming off soon. That could be the answer to the second question, which is what's draining your life. I support you in removing the beard if it serves the drive. So I'm still finding that trying to find certainty about the future is the thing that deadens me the most.
Mm-hmm.
Bama, what's challenging you?
I am in a period of my life that I feel like I'm being invited to rest in ambiguity, and my response to resting in ambiguity is often to try and create a problem that I can solve. And so as I'm in a space of big questions, I keep looking for something to fix, because that gives me a sense of security, and it's not working, and it tends to drive the people around me a little bit crazy. Namely my husband.
This is not a marriage therapy Zoom call, but it is helping. Beamer.
You know, I would just say, to use Barack Obama's phrase, watching some progressives line up in a circular firing squad.
Yeah. So if we were doing this at length, we would ask the question about our sense of purpose in the world and how we feel we're leaning into it or running away. And I'm going to speak for us all and say, I think the last 45 minutes have been a beautiful experience, being invited into purpose. And I hope that's been the same for you listening in. Again, we mean it when we say if something came up for you in this call that feels too big for you to handle right now, not because you're not good enough, but just because sometimes stuff can get overwhelming. Just email us through the 7thstory.com website, and we'll do what we can to help you connect with someone who can support you through that. And our fourth question would be, what's the help that we need right now? And I know that Bamo has the help of his men's group, which starts in 10 minutes. I don't know what you're doing, BMAC, but I'm going to go and smoke a cigarette and talk to a friend on the phone. How about that?
Want me to draw our time to a close?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, my friends, Gareth and Bamo, for this time. Thanks to all of you who've been part of this. May I just say now, may we all let the light of the seventh story shine through us and bring hope to others who have been victimized and who feel beaten and worn down and reduced. And may we each just keep our eyes open for the chances to let that light flow through us to others. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Peace. See ya.
Bye.